All right. So, good evening, everybody. So, the topic tonight is I'm calling it Beyond Not Orthodox and Not Reform, and trying to look at a definition of what is unique about conservative Judaism. And as I said in my rabbi's message yesterday, um, years and years ago, back in the early 90s, I was the scholar in residence for a USY convention, and I had, the staff go around and ask all the students to define conservative Judaism without using the words Orthodox or Reform. And most like couldn't even conceive of a way to do that. But sometimes kids, instead of Orthodox, would say like ultra traditional, and for Reform they say liberal. I said, no, you can't do that either. um, I remember one kid came up with a definition that's a really good definition. He said it is that branch of Judaism which allows you to pick those observances which you find personally meaningful. And that's a great definition, but it is a great definition of Reform Judaism, not of conservative Judaism. Um, so, um, what is it that makes conservative Judaism conservative Judaism? And so I just, because one of the things that I run into very often is people sometimes assume that the development of denominations um, works from like most traditional to least traditional, right? So in the beginning, everybody was Orthodox. And then at some point, conservative Judaism started. And then at some point after that, Reform Judaism started. Marsh, I see you're shaking your head because that's, in fact, not the way it happened. Um, and while Orthodox thinkers will often claim that, up until a certain point in time, ev- the only Judaism was Orthodoxy. Um, in my opinion, that is not correct because Orthodoxy is defined over and against something else. Um, Up until before, let's say, 1810, you simply had Judaism. It wasn't Orthodox Judaism, it was just Judaism. And even within that Judaism, there were differences. I mean, Hasidism started before Reform, and um, you know, there was this great schism between the Gaon of Vilna and the Baal Shem Tov, where the Gaon of Vilna correctly excommunicated the Hasidim, and then the Hasidim incorrectly excommunicated the Lib. And I say that because my great 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 grandfather was the Vilna Gaon's right hand man, the Dubna Maggid. Um, so uh, but um, but it was just Judaism. And then Reform Judaism started in around 1810 or so. And then, so conservative Judaism actually started not as a split off from Orthodoxy, but as a split off from Reform. In other words, there were people within the Reform camp who felt that the reformers had gone too far. Okay, and they wanted to either slam on the brakes or move things back more towards the center, but did not all the way back to what had existed before. Um, and so, first question, was everybody aware that conservative Judaism actually started as a split off from Reform? Okay, good. Um, so ref conservative Judaism actually was formed twice. Okay, in Germany in 1845, when Zachariah Frankel founded the Breslau um, Jewish Theological Seminary. It was the first school to be called the Jewish Theological Seminary. Is Breslau, which is now in, I don't know how to pronounce it, but Wroclaw, Poland. But back then it was Germany, and the precipitating issue was the role of Hebrew in the service. I mean, the argument was whether Hebrew was objectively necessary or only subjectively necessary, because that's, of course, you're dealing with German Jews, and they don't the minds of German Jews don't work the same way as the minds of other Jews work. But so even the reformers felt that Hebrew should be in the service, but they felt it was okay to not have it if for some reason. So they felt it was a subjective necessity and not an objective necessity. Whereas as the people around Frankel felt that it was an objective necessity. And then in the United States, it was founded also the JTS was founded in 1886. But before that, there were a couple of things that happened. I presume most of you have heard of the Trafa banquet. You know about the Trafa banquet? Okay. Right. So the Trafa banquet was in 1883. Okay. And that was really it's believed by many that that was an attempt by the radical reformers to push the more traditional folks out of the movement. They said, what can we do to really, really piss them off so that they'll leave, and we won't have to be looking over our right shoulder all the time, and we'll be able to do whatever we want to do. All right. So the Trafa banquet was in 1883, and then the Pittsburgh platform was in 1885, a very radical statement of the principles of Reform Judaism. And then JTS was founded in 1886. But, and this is worth noting, the people who founded JTS, many of them were in fact Orthodox, because those were the two camps that existed in America at the time, the Orthodox and the Reform. But it wasn't until Schechter took the seminary over in the early 1900s that it was clearly no longer considered an Orthodox institution. Okay. But when the conservative movement started in the United States, it avoided defining itself too much. Okay. Precisely because they didn't want to draw too clear a line between conservative Judaism and Orthodoxy. And there were even plans for JTS and Yeshiva University to merge. Nothing came of them, but even the fact that there would be, discussions indicated that the leadership, didn't feel that there was such an unbridgeable gulf between the two institutions. Um, and so when so Schechter was really the one who founded the institutions of conservative Judaism in America. He founded the United Synagogue, which, of course, I mean, Schechter came to the United States from the UK, and there's a United Synagogue in the UK as well. The difference is that the United Synagogue in the UK is the association of, say, modern or moderate Orthodox shuls. Like the chief rabbi is the head of the United Synagogue, right? Whereas here it's the association of conservative shuls. But for a long time, the official position, and I know this almost word for word, that it wanted to unite all synagogues that were essentially faithful to the traditions, and it did not endorse any specific deviations from tradition that member synagogues might make. Okay, and so they never published any even prayer books. I mean, if you look at it, the Silverman prayer book was the first conservative prayer book. And that was published like in the 1950s, right? Prior to that, conservative and Orthodox shuls pretty much used the same books, like the Boxer Siddur or the Birnbaum Siddur. You would find that in Orthodox shuls and conservative shuls. We didn't publish our own Humash until the early decades of the current century, right? Prior to that, it was the Hertz Humash, and again, used interchangeably in Orthodox and conservative settings, right? And a lot of synagogues had, particularly larger ones. So, I mean, at that point, let's say, from the 1920s on until the late 50s, early 60s, right? The significant difference between Orthodox shuls and conservative shuls was what? Yeah, Sue.
Sitting together. I don't know.
Right,
Just
the
look like
mechitza, right? Mixed seating, right? That was the main difference. And I know, even like, I mean, I didn't know um my father's father, let alone my father's grandfather. But from everything that I've heard, my father's grandfather, my great grandfather, was quite firm, quite observant. But they actually belonged to the Ocean Parkway Jewish Center, which is a conservative shul. But at the time, the Ocean Parkway Jewish Center had mixed seating in the main sanctuary, and in the basement they had a base medrash, which I mean, it didn't actually have separate seating. It just didn't have women at all. Um, but so people who were Orthodox, that was acceptable, and that's where my great grandfather davened. Um, and the difference between the two was not um, that great, although it would happen that a conservative shul, that is to say, a shul that belonged to the United Synagogue, because there were United Synagogue shuls that had separate seating. Some of them had actual mechitzas, and some of them didn't have like physical mechitzas, but the men were on one side and the women were on the other side or whatever. and it would happen that they would build a new building and the mechitza disappeared. Or the rabbi would say, to get rid of the, and there were lawsuits. There were lawsuits all over the place about that because, and without going into too much detail, I mean, shuls will not rule on like which religious interpretation is correct or not correct, right? But if the bylaws, for example, say, you know, this congregation shall remain an Orthodox congregation, right? That a judge might say, well, getting rid of the mechitza violates the shul's own bylaws. But there were lots and lots of lawsuits over that. But at the same time, it was very, very common for Orthodox rabbis from either Yeshiva University or the Hebrew Theological College in Skokie to take conservative pulpits. Right now, why would and well into the 1960s, why would an Orthodox rabbi take a conservative pulpit? Because you had to earn a living, right? And here's what everybody knew. What everybody knew, right? And that's why, I'm wary sometimes of people saying, well, it's inevitable that this, that, or the other will happen. Okay. In the 1950s and the 1960s, everybody knew that orthodoxy in America had no future. Everybody knew that, including the Orthodox. Orthodoxy in America had no future. And therefore, if you wanted, to make a living as a rabbi, or you wanted, to salvage what could be salvaged, you could take a conservative pulpit because that was the wave of the future. The conservative movement was far and away the largest and most dominant movement on the American Jewish scene. That would continue forever, right? Everybody knew that, right? Orthodoxy has no future. Conservative movement is and will always remain the largest and most dominant movement in American Judaism, right? Everybody knows that. Everybody knew that, right? Well, we saw how well that turned, right? So, when people say everybody know this, that, or the other, actually, we don't. Okay. But it wasn't really until the 1960s that the conservative movement attempted to define itself. But even, I mean, the main synagogue at JTS, for example, the main synagogue at JTS had a mechitza up until very long ago. And when JTS voted to ordain women as rabbis and cantors, well, it was untenable for the only minyan at JTS to not be egalitarian, right? So they started an egalitarian minyan too, but the main minyan was the non-egalitarian. It did not have a physical mechitza, but it had separate seating. But more and more, and I think the non-egalitarian minyan today doesn't even exist, not because JTS says it can't, but they just don't get a minyan. There's not enough people who are interested in a non-egalitarian minyan. But it was really the 1960s. There were a couple of things that forced the conservative movement to try to define itself a little bit better. And one was, well, the founding of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in 1968. because Reconstructionism up until that point was not a separate denomination. I mean, Mordecai Kaplan, who was the founder of Reconstructionism, was a faculty member at JTS. I mean, in fact, Kaplan lived to be over 100, and he was a faculty member at JTS for something like 70 or 75 years. But Reconstructionism was like a school of thought, and you could be conservative and Reconstructionist, you could be Reform and Reconstructionist. But in 68, it became more its own denomination. Um, so, so that pushed, but even like more than that was in 1972, a group called Ezrat Nashim. Ezrat Nashim, that's kind of a pun because Ezrat Nashim means the women's balcony, but it also means help for women. And they picketed the RA convention demanding that women be counted for the minyan, demanding that women be ordained as rabbis, and so on and so forth. And so, ignoring these kind of issues was no longer tenable. But the fight over women's ordination. So let's say it started in 1972 with Ezrat Nashim, and it was resolved with the decision to ordain women in 83, and the first female conservative rabbi was ordained actually in 85. But this also served to right. So when the Reconstructionist College started, so that took like the farthest left of the conservative movement out of the movement, and the decision to ordain women took a lot of the farthest right of the conservative movement out. They started what was called first the Union for Traditional Conservative Judaism, and then just the Union for Traditional Judaism. And a lot of those folks have, formally become Orthodox. But so as the conservative movement was starting to try and define itself a little bit better, so Professor Ismar Schorsch, who was the chancellor of JTS from around 1985 till around 2005, wrote a little booklet called The Sacred Cluster, where he spoke about the 7 things that define conservative Judaism. What I'm going to do, I'm going to briefly share my screen so that I can bring those up. Okay, so in red, this is Schorsch's Sacred Cluster. The centrality of modern Israel. Okay, and I think that this is actually true. I mean, the conservative movement has always been Zionist, since its very beginning, which was not true of either Orthodoxy or of Reform. Hebrew, the irreplaceable language of Jewish expression. Devotion to the ideal of Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael means the totality of Israel. The defining role of Torah in the reshaping of Judaism. The study of Torah. The governance of Jewish life by halakha, and belief in God. Right now, it doesn't mean that any of these are necessarily like, these are things that characterize conservative Judaism and only conservative Judaism and other movements don't have them. But these are like, the pillars of what it means to be conservative. And are there any questions or comments about you know Schorsch's idea of the sacred cluster? And just jump in because I can't, because I'm sharing the screen, so I can't see everybody's. If anybody wants to either ask a question or make a comment about that.
I just wanted to add that the centrality of the state of Israel is so important because the founders of Reform Judaism were against the return to Zion, and Orthodox Judaism just assumed that that's what everybody wants, but nobody ever said we are for it as a movement.
Right. I mean, early Orthodox, look, there's still Neturei Karta and Satmar and whatever, right? But the idea, it's obviously not right. So the centrality of Eretz Yisrael still exists, the land of Israel, but not the centrality of Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, and for different reasons. For Reform, it was the mission of Israel, like the mission of Israel to bring the knowledge of God all over the world. And that we're no longer a nation, we're just a religion. And for anti-Zionist orthodoxy, it was chutzpah, right? God is the one who decides when we go back, and are certainly to pray for the return to Zion, but not to actually work in favor of it.
Yeah, that's why I just appreciated what you said, because that's a very, very good definition.
Yeah. But some of these concepts have unique interpretations within conservative Judaism, right? First of all, Torah means all of Jewish wisdom, right? That's not necessarily unique to conservative either, right? If I gave a Devar Torah, right, and everything that was in the Devar Torah were quotes from Heschel, right? Nobody would say, well, that wasn't really a Devar Torah because you didn't quote from the Torah, right? Torah is the totality of Jewish wisdom, right? So we would all agree that Heschel is Torah, right? A more controversial assertion might be that Yehuda Amichai is Torah, or some of the lyrics of Bob Dylan counts as Torah, right? That might be a more controversial assertion, right? But certainly, we don't just mean, literally the 5 books of Moses. But what is unique is that in conservative Judaism, the study of Torah includes academic, scientific methods, right? You have heard me say things like, we don't know if this really happened, right? We don't know if this really happened. We don't know if there really was a person named Abraham who had 2 sons, Isaac and Ishmael, right? You can't be an Orthodox rabbi and say those kinds of things, right? It is I would use the term dogma in Orthodoxy, right? That the text of the Torah as we have it now was revealed word for word to Moses on Mount Sinai and has been transmitted accurately since then. And furthermore, everything that is in that text is true. Now, can you believe that and be conservative? Yes, of course you can. Right? Must you believe that? No, you are not obliged to believe that. And I would say that no conservative rabbis believe that. Many conservative lay people believe that because they haven't had their minds poisoned by people like me who introduce other perspectives. Right? But to me, intellectual honesty is really sort of a key pillar. Um, so we study the Torah by the same methods that it would be studied in a university department, but not exclusively. Um, and this, like, if you said to me, name one thing that definitively differentiates conservative Judaism from Orthodox Judaism, I would say that it is the academic or a non-fundamentalist approach to the Torah. Now, are there Orthodox rabbis who take a non-fundamentalist approach? I believe that there are, but they're not allowed to talk about it, right? I mean, um, it, if this piques your interest at all, like, go to Google and Google Louis Jacobs. All right, Louis Jacobs was the founder of the Masorti movement in the UK, the UK's equivalent of the conservative movement. He was slated to be the chief rabbi of the UK, but he published a book where he acknowledged his belief in what's known as the documentary hypothesis. I don't have time to go into it. And he was excommunicated. He was derailed. He was excommunicated. Um, he was fired from his shul. He started a new shul, and that became the sort of, mother church, if I can use that phrase, of the Masorti movement in the UK. The other thing that's different, and Marilyn, you actually you answered the question that I asked. How would you define conservative Judaism? And if you have it handy, I'd love for you to share it, because I think
Um,
it's pretty on target.
I'm not sure exactly if this is the same wording I sent you. A movement that supports traditional laws and practices, yet is open to thoughtful change.
Right. I think that's a great definition, actually. Supports traditional laws and practices, yet is open to thoughtful change, right? Because we consider, I mean, and this is where gets a little complicated, right? I mean, we consider ourselves to be a halachic movement, right? That is to say, we are bound by halacha. We also say that halacha can change, right? Halacha can change to meet the needs of contemporary Jews, right? But halacha has within it its own process, right? Just like the United States Constitution, right? The United States Constitution has within the Constitution a process for amending the Constitution, right? If you couldn't, I mean, if the U.S. Constitution could not be amended, we probably would have gotten rid of it, right? Because there are clearly things in it that don't work anymore, right? So the Constitution has within it a method for amending the Constitution. And similarly, halacha has within it a method for amending halacha, right? But that is not unlimited, right? That is not unlimited, right? But there's also, and this gets back to Shorsh's idea of the emphasis on Klal Yisrael, right? That, there are things that the masses of Jews simply won't accept, right? And very often it's the other way around. I mean, it's the masses push official change, right? Like the masses of the conservative laity were ready for egalitarianism well before the movement, started ordaining women as rabbis and cantors. I believe that to be the case. Mike, you need to unmute. Yes.
Not easy. I'm not used to this. So just a quick question. Would the Orthodox agree with you that there is a procedure for amending halacha?
No. No, I mean, no. There is no way to simply, like, this isn't working anymore, so we can change it. All right. What there is, obviously, I mean, there are new situations, right? I mean, nobody in the 1600s was writing about organ transplants, right? Because it wasn't a real thing, right? And when organ transplants, right? I mean, organ transplants is a clear example, right? Because halacha, I mean, not just halacha. I mean, in general, how did you know somebody was dead? Their heart stopped beating, right? Their heart stopped beating and they stopped breathing, right? The problem with that is that if the heart has stopped beating, you can't use it for a transplant anymore, right? But you also, I mean, if the definition of death is your heart has stopped, then you can't harvest a heart for transplantation because we have what's known as the dead donor, right? You can't harvest organs from a living person to transplant them into another person, right? So for heart transplants to be allowed, you had to have another way of defining death, and that's where brain death came in. But it wasn't acceptable until people knew about it, right? And it was somewhat controversial. The process of accepting brain death was somewhat controversial, but I mean, there are sources in the Talmud that talk about decapitation as equivalent to death, even if the body is still moving. Okay. And brain death is functional decapitation because there's no blood getting to the brain anymore. Okay. So there is halacha for new situations, but there is no method to change or amend halacha. Right. So that would be a clear difference, right? I mean, that would be, like you have, for example, Orthodox rabbis saying things like, I hear the pain of gay and lesbian Jews who want to be part of the Orthodox community, but want to have their orientation and sexuality and families acknowledged. And I hear the pain, and I wish there was a way that we could change it, but we can't. We can't, right? I mean, look the other way, don't ask, don't tell, for sure, right? But actually change the halakha can't be done, right? So that would be like a clear difference.
But Rabbi,
Go
one
ahead.
area that Orthodox rabbis did change the halacha based on their, I'll call it Zionistic trending, because that's how I grew up, was the laws of the Shabbat in the army, meaning I'm allowed to carry all kinds of things. I'm allowed to answer the walkie-talkie, even if the guy is just asking me a stupid question and not anything that got to do with pikuach nefesh. So we changed the halacha based on just that. If I didn't answer, I'll just give that simple example. If I didn't answer the walkie-talkie when the guy asked me a stupid question, then I would be risking the situation, like the child who cried wolf, that in a real situation I wouldn't be answering. So my rabbis actually changed the halacha, saying you should answer every call, even if it's the stupidest thing in the world.
Well, except that I mean, we could have a really interesting discussion about whether that's changing the halacha or not, right? Because it's based in the idea of pikuach nefesh doche Shabbat, right? And then you get into like a Shema situation, right? I mean, it's the same thing. Like I've read shuvot that say that, and it's not universally accepted, right? But that if you drive somebody to the hospital on Shabbat, you can drive yourself back home, because otherwise you'll say, ugh, last time I drove somebody to the hospital and I was stuck there for 24 hours with no food and nothing to do. I'm not doing this anymore, right? So I mean, they didn't say that all of a sudden driving car is not malacha, it's not mavir, whatever. It's just a broader definition of possible pikuach nefesh, right? So similarly with the walkie-talkie or carrying the gun or whatever it is, right? It's not that they're not saying these aren't melachot. They're saying that we have an expansive definition of possible pikuach nefesh. I think I don't see that as changing the halacha. It may be
Okay,
changing the guidelines, but it's not changing
that's a
the
good
baseline.
explanation. Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you.
right. I mean, like to me, the clearest example of that is, permission to drive home again from the hospital after you drove somebody there on Shabbat. Okay.
Rabbi, question,
So
a
yeah,
comment,
go ahead.
a comment on point B, which I think read something like Hebrew is the central to Jewish expression. Are they talking
Yeah,
about prayer book Hebrew, Torah Hebrew, or conversational, or, or
all of the above, right? All of the above, right? I mean, right? You hear me not infrequently saying, you can't really be a fully knowledgeable Jew if you don't know Hebrew, right? I mean, there are nuances in the Hebrew that no translation will cover, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And I mean, I'll give you an example of how that works in practice, right? So the three major rabbinic bodies in America all have their convention in Israel every so often, right? That is to say, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the Reform, the Rabbinical Assembly, which is us, and the Rabbinical Council of America, which is the modern Orthodox rabbis. And the one time that I attended an RA convention in Israel, the entire convention was conducted in Hebrew. Okay, whereas both the RCA convention and the CCAR convention were conducted in English, right? But I mean, and I remember because I had to learn how to say to table in Hebrew, right? Because I introduced a motion to table something in one of the business meetings, right? But and the Israelis who came to speak to the convention, they said, "Wow, last week we spoke to the Orthodox rabbis and they said you got to speak English, right? But we're speaking to the conservative rabbis and the whole thing is in Hebrew." I mean, the principle of the importance of Hebrew is really strong, right? And it doesn't mean that every conservative rabbi can really carry on a conversation in Hebrew, but the assumption is that you should be able to do so. The assumption should be that in a study session they can put before you text in Hebrew and not have to provide a translation. Okay, but yes, I mean, considering that the conservative movement started in Germany with a fight over the role of Hebrew, it's no surprise, right? So, I would let me take a crack at my definition of conservative Judaism, which is not dissimilar to Maryland's, actually. That is to say, that movement which is guided or governed by halacha, utilizes modern academic methods of text study. But one thing that I would add is has a high tolerance for non-conforming behavior, right? And that is, I think, a difference, at least today, between conservative Judaism and most of Orthodoxy. That is to say, like within the Orthodox community, there's a lot of pressure to conform, right? I mean, one example is that when we lived in Baltimore in a Orthodox neighborhood, an air conditioning box was a very popular commodity. Why? Because it was not acceptable in that community to have a television. Okay. But a lot of people did have televisions, right? I mean, so you certainly, if you had one, could not like acknowledge that you had one and therefore could not be seen bringing one into your house. I mean, this was back when, TVs were big, right? Not just, right? So you would buy a TV, you would put it in an air conditioning box, and you would bring it into your house in an air conditioning box so that the neighbors wouldn't know you had a TV, right? But look, I mean, we have people leading services who are not Shomer Shabbos, right? We have people leading services who don't keep kosher. We have people leading services who are married to non-Jews, right? And nobody says boo, right? In most of Orthodoxy, and in 1950s, 1960s Orthodoxy, that would have been accepted unquestionably. But in most of Orthodoxy today, that would not be accepted, right? There is low tolerance for non-conforming behavior. Whereas we have it, and realistically so. I mean, if we said, only people who were fully observant could lead services, I would be more tired than I am, right? At the end of service, right? That's just not our constituency, right? Mike.
Just to share a funny thought, but for a while I was going to Ezras Yisrael on Montrose Road, which is an Orthodox shul. I mean, but they held their daily minyanim at the Hebrew home, and that way, if they needed, they'd bring in the mashgiach to make a minyan,
Right.
and meanwhile, the Altakakas who lived there could come in and have a minyan. So it was a symbiotic relationship. And I was saying Kaddish at the time, and so I would lead services. And I gave one of the guys a lift home, and he starts asking, so what do you do? And I say, I do real estate. And he says, oh, what do you do on Shabbos? And I said, well, I organize my life so that my first weekend client is Sunday afternoon, and my second weekend client is Sunday morning. And so the problem doesn't come up unless I have 3 or 4 clients at same weekend. And he says, well, but why don't you wouldn't you, he said, I would find a guy to cover and I would trade with them. And I said, it's just not done, but it could be done, but theoretically, but it's not done. And so he made it clear that he was uncomfortable with me leading services because I was non-observant or non-Shomer Shabbos as he sees it. And so the next time I went, I warned the gabbai, I know you want me to lead services. I'd love to, but I have to tell you there's somebody among your crowd that is uncomfortable with me leading services. And I told him why. And his answer was, who? And I pointed with my head, and he said, oh, not to worry. So it wasn't a halachic question. Near
Right.
as I could tell, it was a politically imbued question, and that was the basis for the decision making rather than halacha. And I was really surprised. I had no clue how he would react, but it was his shul, so tell me what you want. And that was his way of, it seemed to me that was his way of deciding things. I thought it was absolutely fascinating.
Right. Right. But the point, right, the point is that however that would be resolved, it would never be even raised in our shul, right? Never be raised in our, or for that matter, any conservative shul that I'm aware of. That, oh, you can't daven from, because you're not Shomer Shabbos or whatever, right? And so like I say, there's a high tolerance for non-conforming or heterodox behavior. The last thing I want, because it's getting late, but I want to tackle, because I started by saying that in the 1950s and 1960s, everybody knew that Orthodoxy had no future and conservative Judaism would always be the dominant movement in American Jewish life, right? And now, of course, everybody knows that the conservative movement has no future. We're going to die out. We're going to be forced to merge with the reform or whatever. And I mean, what you have right now, you have an interesting phenomenon where you have a lot of thriving institutions that are conservative in all but name. Okay. And again, this is, not for people our age so much, but there is a cluster of organizations known as Hadar, Yeshivat Hadar, Kehilat Hadar, etc. Okay. It was started by 3 JTS students who wanted a place that had good davening that they would like. All right, it's become a yeshiva. They even give smicha. They have all kinds of programs. It started on the Upper West Side, but now there's Hadar in Chicago. There's Hadar here in Washington. It's this huge, thriving thing that mostly attracts people, let's say 40 and under, right? Although the founders all just more or less turned 50. So, but it was founded by 3 conservative rabbis who are all members of the art, and they assiduously insist that they're not conservative, right? What are they? We're halachic egalitarian. Right now, you explain to me what is the difference between conservative and halachic egalitarian, right? And I understand. Look, I understand why they don't want to be labeled conservative, because conservative is not sexy, it's not thriving, et cetera, right? But I have to say, and certainly, our own shul's unhappy history with the United Synagogue, right, has, certainly influenced my. There is one institution of the conservative movement in whose survival I am deeply invested, and that is Kehilat Shalom, right? For obvious selfish reasons, right? I am the rest of them, I don't care, right? What I care about is the ideology of conservative Judaism. That is to say, a broad tent that is guided by halakha, that is by and large egalitarian, although there still are a handful of non-egalitarian conservative shuls, and they're certainly welcome. But the ideas that we stand for, that's really important. The institutions, not so much. And I think that the ideals that we stand for do have a future, even if the institutions don't, because, if it didn't exist, we'd have to create it. I really do. I think that it is an absolute existential necessity for the Jewish world that the perspective that we represent be present on the scene. All right. Again, I'll wrap up. Again, questions, comments, points you want to make. Yeah, Marcia.
It's very interesting. The synagogue that I'm a member, that my family belongs, is Torah egalitarian, but not egalitarian for leading services. And the interesting thing, they hired a new rabbi, and when they were in the search, when they put out the search notice, that the graduates of JTS, because it was non-egalitarian, nobody applied. And the result is the new rabbi, she's an Orthodox rabbi. She's an Orthodox from the
YC, from Maharat. Yeah,
that's right.
Uh-huh.
And she had been 10 years in a conservative synagogue, sort of like Mariah in Montreal, but now she's able to lead a congregation, but not lead services. but this community, it's interesting. It's multi-generational. Of course, it's in an area where families, multi-generations live, but it's women participate, women can do everything except lead services. And but yet it's a very inclusive community. At first I wasn't sure how comfortable I would be with it, but it turns out that I've gotten used to it. In the service is, there's no English in the service. It's an Orthodox service, but it's very participatory by everybody. And I'm finding I miss the service that I'm comfortable with, Kehilat Shalom. So I enjoy the times when I do, but it's also nice to be able to be in shul for a service.
Sure.
But it's
We miss your Torah reading, Marcia.
thank you. One of these times I'll try it again. I'll try it. I might try it again if that's okay. When I
Sure.
know in advance that I would be there.
Sure, that'd be
It's
great.
a-
Just let me know.
Okay. But I like the traditional. I like it. It's sort of a compromise. I like the comfort of a service that is inclusive. I mean, is participatory. And I like the tradition that goes with it. And I sort of lost my train of thought, but anyways, it's been very interesting to see this almost Orthodox community, and yet how because a lot of people are Shomer Shabbos and a lot aren't.
Right. Wendy and then Mike.
So before I ask Rabbi my question, Marcia, so do they get along though? The two, those who are Shomer Shabbat and those who are not?
They do. This is a community. It's roughly, they went through a little difficult period. It's about 300 families. They get about 150, 175 people every Shabbat.
Wow.
It's full, and you've got kids running everywhere. And this is what makes it such a warm community.
Yeah.
And
bet.
they claim its participation has somewhat fallen off because of issues with the previous rabbi, but it's pulling back together. And this is another thing. It's very comforting because people, it's very warm and friendly. And the participation, and it's very Jewish.
Yeah.
A very comfortable community,
That's neat.
Jewish community. And the other thing I have to say about this, I moved back to Chicago. I grew up in the Chicago Jewish community on the north side. Chicago was always a very neighborhoods from my if you knew the address of someone, you knew the origins and the origins in Europe. And you also knew where the Jewish communities are. Where I lived has moved up to the North Shore suburbs. And it's very much like what I grew up with. It's got its pluses and minuses.
Yeah.
But it's very different from what I was comfortable with in Maryland. And I have to say, I miss Gaithersburg. And I miss Kehilat Shalom.
Come on back. We're ready.
I'm in
All
an
right,
age
Wendy,
I
so
need
you
my
had-
family.
I did have one quick question. In
Yeah.
2005, I went on my first trip to Israel, and it was a trip that was put on by the Women's League for Conservative Judaism. I figured I needed a tour, something a little more structured for my first time around, or I'd just
Right.
miss a lot. And the funny thing was, the El Al security agent who interviewed me before they would let me get on the plane said, and why are you coming? And I said, well, I'm with the Masorti Jewish women's Masorti movement. And she said, oh, I don't know anything about that. And I looked at her, and you could tell she was a very intelligent person. I didn't believe for a minute that she had never heard of conservative or Masorti Judaism.
I believe it.
And yet,
Well, I mean, it's entirely possible, and you're talking about now, almost 20 years ago.
yeah, that's true.
Um, I mean, I will tell you, I have a couple of friends who are members of the Israeli diplomatic corps. Um, and before you are sent to a posting in the United States, they teach you how to take an aliyah, because you will inevitably, be a guest speaker in a shul on Shabbat and be offered an aliyah. And many, many, many secular Israelis have no idea what to do. And that
Huh.
just will not do, obviously. I mean, look, very
Basic
good
good
that the
manners.
foreign ministry insists that their people know how to take an aliyah.
Yeah.
Um, but that's the reality. So I don't find that. I mean, today I find that less plausible, but 20 years ago that would have been entirely plausible.
Okay.
All right. Yeah. Mike?
Yeah, I just the thing that keeps troubling me is the basis for the movement toward, you want to call it modernity or recognition of modern life or whatever. Is it the religion's job to change, to make it acceptable, or should the religion be sticking to its beliefs, and people make the adjustment in their own heads as to what is realistic or not in their current situation? I'm actually more comfortable thinking of myself as non-observant than I am thinking of myself as it's okay because I'm in the conservative movement. And it's not just conservatives. The Orthodox guy gave me an answer where it wasn't halachic, and it was simply practical. And so then the question is, how we vary our heads according to either halacha and the need to fit inside it, or halacha and the acceptance of it and us as, what was the words you used, non-hetero something or other.
Tolerance for non-conforming behavior.
Yeah. I mean, and to me, it's a really important question, because to the extent that you buy into people, rabbis, movements changing halacha, then to me, you weaken the very essence. I mean, you're debasing, you're devaluing the currency. That's, to me. Rabbi, you started out as a reformed and switched to conservative because you felt the need for halacha. I'm curious, does it bother you at all, the thing I'm talking about? If I'm making any
My
sense.
answer would be, and I mean, I will give you a quick answer, right? Because I could do 90 minutes on this alone, without
Easy.
breaking a sweat. But 'twas ever thus, right? I mean, for a couple of reasons. One is that, this refrain that appears in the Talmud a few times, right? Where God says, these are the laws which you should live by. Chaibeth. And it says live by, not die by. Right? I mean, the Maccabees at first said no fighting on Shabbat. And when the Greeks realized, oh, we'll just wait to Shabbat and then we'll kill all the Jews, ah, maybe we should fight on Shabbat, right? Is that a change in, right? Or, what Rabbi Goldman said about what the guidelines that for Shabbat in the Israeli army, right? Or I've taught about how, the Talmud says you cannot do business with idolaters within 3 days of their holidays, right? And how Tosafot and the Meiri redefined Christianity as not idolatry, because otherwise Jews would not be allowed to do business with Christians, right? This wasn't the law committee at 3080 Broadway, right? This was the Meiri in Provence in 1200, right? Was ever thus. I mean, you cannot have a religion that's impossible to live by. Now, sometimes we have to say no, right? I mean, there's like contemporary American society says fidelity to your spouse is not important, right? Judaism says, yes, it is, right? Contemporary American society increasingly says, doesn't have to be a man and a woman, or two men or two women. It could be a throuple, it could be three, it could be four. And we say no, right? I mean, there are things that I hope we will never accept, right? But, look, I mean, if you want to, the driving to shul, when the conservative movement in the 1950s said you could drive to shul, right? And that's totally misunderstood. It means drive to shul. It doesn't mean drive to the golf course, drive to the mall, right? It means drive to shul, right? But I don't think that is unrelated to the fact that Jews were suddenly living in the suburbs and no longer within walking distance of their shul, right? I mean, look, I could argue pro and con for that teshuva, right? But I mean, that was to my mind, that was a clear example of sociology driving everything else. But I don't think this is a new phenomenon, right? I mean, here's the difference. We acknowledge that halakha has evolved to meet changing realities. Orthodoxy insists that it never has, even though it has. And that's why we're right and they're wrong.
Right.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeshua.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, Mike, could you stick around for 30 seconds?
Sure.
Good to see you, Marcia.
It was good to see
Night.
all of you and
Take
enjoy
care,
your-
Marcia.
You too, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was really good.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank
you. Ta-da.
Right. So I'm just trying to clarify who's doing what this Shabbos. And you are in the spreadsheet for davening with a question mark after.
Yeah, no, so Gail and I have, I think, worked it out. She is the Shliach Tzibor for Shabbos, Saturday. And I will do next week because I have your site.
Okay.
So that's how we ended up doing it.
Okay. It was not yet reflected in the spreadsheet, so I just wanted to.
Yeah, I don't do spreadsheets.
No, that's fine. That's
I
fine. I
emailed
mean, we
her.
are actually based on the sociological fact of people not doing the spreadsheet going to go back to a rotation.
Good. Makes
All right.
sense.
See ya. Good night.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.